Hello, we're going to talk about rhomboid major and rhomboid minor and their actions at the acromioclavicular and sternoclavicular joints. Rhomboid minor runs from the spinous processes of C7 to T1 down to the medial border of the scapula near the root of the spine of the scapula. Rhomboid major runs from the spinous process of T2 to T5 and also along the medial border of the scapula between the root of the spine of the scapula and the inferior angle of the scapula. The sternoclavicular joint, or SC joint, is made up of the manubrium of the sternum and the sternal end of the clavicle. So we have elevation, depression, protraction, and retraction. So elevation and depression is in the frontal plane along an anterior-posterior axis. Protraction and retraction are in the transverse plane along a vertical axis. The acromioclavicular joint, or the AC joint, is made of the acromial end of the clavicle and the acromion of the scapula. So the actions there that we're going to talk about today are upward rotation and downward rotation, which are roughly in the frontal plane along an anterior-posterior axis. So the first joint we're going to look at is the sternoclavicular joint. So that joint is up here. We're going to look at the transverse plane motions. So if I go through protraction, we'll see that the entire rhomboid complex lengthens, which means that it will shorten or contract with retraction. So the first primary action of both rhomboid major and minor is retraction of the clavicle at the sternoclavicular joint. If we look at the scapula moving relative to the rib cage and relative to the spine, that is simply a consequence of the rotation in the transverse plane of the clavicle. Some books will state that retraction and protraction are movements of the scapula at the scapulothoracic joint, and it'll often describe them as linear motions. But in reality, it is motion at the sternoclavicular joint. So when I do protraction, which is a rotational axial motion, the scapula moves away from the spine. When I do retraction, again, a rotational axial motion, the scapula moves medially towards the spine. But those are, in fact, both rotational motions at the sternoclavicular joint. Next, we're going to look at the acromioclavicular joint. Normally, we would see the action of upward rotation, like this, coupled with elevation of the clavicle at the SC joint, and downward rotation, which looks like this, coupled with depression of the clavicle at the SC joint. But to isolate it for our purposes here, downward rotation would look like this. And that would shorten the fibers of rhomboid minor and major, but the inferior fibers of rhomboid major would shorten the most because they have the best leverage. And then upward rotation would look like this. And it would, in fact, lengthen the fibers of the entire rhomboid complex. So what that means is rhomboid minor and major will contract or shorten with downward rotation of the scapula at the AC joint. So that is a primary action, and they will lengthen with upward rotation of the AC joint. Next, we're going to look at the sternoclavicular joint, and we'll find that rhomboid major does depression of the clavicle at the SC joint. Now, the anterior-posterior axis for that joint comes right about through here. If a muscle is close to an axis within a given plane, it will have minimal action. So rhomboid minor will have limited action. Part of it might contribute slightly to elevation of the SC joint. Part of it might contribute partially to depression of the SC joint. But either way, it's very close to the axis. Rhomboid major, being very inferior to the axis, will be very proficient at depression of the clavicle at the SC joint. So if you look at the motion, as I go through elevation, Rhomboid major in particular is going to lengthen, and then as I go through depression, rhomboid major actually contracts and shortens significantly. So the reason for that is we have this axis here, again, very close to rhomboid minor. We have to look at rotational motion, not linear motion. So anything down here that is pulling this way on the scapula is going to create a counterclockwise rotation of the scapula at the AC joint, which is depression of the AC joint, and a counterclockwise rotation of the clavicle at the SC joint, which is depression of the SC joint. So a lot of books will list elevation of the scapula as an action of rhomboid major and minor, and they list that as the scapula at the scapulothoracic joint, which is not a real joint, and they may list that as a linear motion. Similarly, they will list retraction and protraction as linear motions. That can lead to a lot of confusion because there are no true linear motions of the scapula relative to the rib cage or relative to the spine. And the things that even look close to linear motions are consequences of rotation at the AC and SC joint. So when they say elevation of the scapula at the scapulothoracic joint, that is blatantly false. We can see that as we go through downward rotation of the AC, the medial border lifts superiorly, but it is not a separate action from downward rotation at the AC joint. And we can see that most of the rhomboids, especially rhomboid major, actually does depression of the clavicle at the SC joint. So if you can look at the rotational motions, I think everything becomes far more clear. So in a quick recap, rhomboid minor, rhomboid major, primary actions, retraction of the clavicle at the SC joint. When we do retraction of the clavicle at the SC joint, the scapula moves medially. Downward rotation at the AC joint. When we do downward rotation isolated, the medial border rotates upward. And then depression of the clavicle at the SC joint. And of course, when a muscle contracts, it tries to do all the actions at once. So when rhomboids major and minor contract, they would try to do depression, downward rotation, and retraction all at the same time.